There is a specific kind of suffering that no one warns you about. It doesn't arrive with sirens. It doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis. It creeps in quietly, usually somewhere between 40 and 60, while everything around you looks exactly the way it was supposed to look. The career is established. The house is real. The relationships are intact. By every external standard, you built the life correctly. And yet, in the silence between obligations, when the noise of productivity finally stops, there it is, a hollow ache you cannot name, pressing against the inside of your chest like something that has been waiting a very long time to be heard. You tell yourself it will pass. You fill the silence faster. You plan more, achieve more, stay busier than ever. But the ache doesn't leave, it deepens. And the more you achieve, the more incomprehensible it becomes, because you did everything right. And it still isn't enough. This isn't failure. This isn't depression in the clinical sense. This is something Carl Jung witnessed in patient after patient, decade after decade. And what he discovered about it is one of the most unsettling and ultimately liberating insights in the history of human psychology. The people who fell apart in the second half of life weren't the ones who failed. They were the ones who succeeded. The high performers, the dutiful partners, the respected professionals. They had constructed exactly what society instructed them to construct, and they arrived at midlife holding it all, only to realize the architecture was built for someone they no longer were. Jung didn't call this a crisis of failure. He called it a crisis of success. And he believed it was almost entirely preventable if someone had told these people early enough what the second half of life actually demands. Nobody told them. And that silence is what Carl Jung philosophy exists to break. What Jung uncovered after decades of observing how human beings age, not biologically, but psychologically, was that there were 4 specific inner structures that separated people who arrived at old age with genuine peace from people who arrived with quiet terror. He called them pillars, not metaphorical pillars, actual psychological foundations that either existed in a person's interior life or didn't, and their presence or absence determined everything. The quality of your relationships, the depth of your contentment, your capacity to face loss, your ability to experience joy without the constant shadow of dread. 4 pillars. Almost nobody builds them, not because they're impossible, but because the entire first half of life trains you to build exactly the wrong things instead. Today, we examine all 4, the specific inner transformations Jung observed in people who didn't merely endure aging, but were genuinely deepened by it. Why the majority resist every single one of these shifts until circumstances force their hand. And why beginning this work now, regardless of where you are in life's arc, changes everything that comes after. Jung described human life as the trajectory of the sun. In the morning, the sun ascends. It gains force, extends its reach, floods the landscape with light. Everything moves upward and outward. This is youth. This is the first half of life, the phase of construction, identity formation, ego development, worldly establishment. The ego is the essential engine of this phase. Without a strong, functional ego, you cannot navigate education, career, intimate relationships, the brutal social architecture of adult life. You need it. It serves you. It is appropriate. But the sun reaches its highest point. Noon arrives, and what follows noon is not failure. It is not decline. It is the nature of the arc itself. The sun descends, not because something went wrong, because that is what suns do, because that is their nature. Jung observed that human psychology follows this same arc with precise and unforgiving fidelity. The second half of life is a descent, and he was careful about that word. Descent, not decline. Decline implies deterioration. Descent means moving deeper, moving inward, reaching layers of existence that cannot be accessed while you are still climbing. The afternoon light illuminates what noon's harsh brightness obscured. The catastrophe Jung witnessed, repeated in patient after patient, was this. Almost everyone tried to keep the sun rising after noon. They reached 45, 55, 65, and continued behaving as though they were still in the morning, still measuring worth through external achievement, still feeding the ego what it demanded in youth, still using the metrics of the first half to evaluate the second. And this refusal, this fundamental inability to honor the natural arc of a life, became, in Jung's observation, the primary source of psychological suffering in the second half of human existence. He stated it plainly. A person who clings to the values of youth in the afternoon of their life is not preserving themselves. They are betraying themselves. They are resisting the very process that would finally deliver what they spent the entire morning searching for. Because the morning of life promises fulfillment through accumulation, only the afternoon delivers it through release. That is what these four pillars are constructed upon. Not strategies for adding more to your life, pathways for releasing what no longer belongs, and discovering that what remains, once the excess is stripped away, is not merely sufficient. It is everything. It was always everything. The first pillar Jung identified was the inward turn. And this may be the most consistently misunderstood shift in all of human psychology, because when most people hear that phrase, they imagine passivity, withdrawal, a kind of useful self-absorption. Jung intended something entirely different. He meant redirecting the enormous energy you expended conquering the external world toward exploring the internal one. And he considered this the single most consequential psychological event available to a human being in the second half of life. For decades, every unit of your attention has been aimed outward. What do others think of me? How do I rank? What have I accumulated? Am I falling behind? This outward orientation was not a flaw. It was the correct orientation for the first half. You needed to construct a life within the world, but Jung observed that somewhere around midlife, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, the outer world quietly stops answering the questions that matter most. You can acquire more, accomplish more, be recognized more broadly, and the interior emptiness doesn't shift. Because the emptiness is not a response to what you lack out there. It is a response to what you have never explored in here. The inward turn is the moment you stop fleeing from yourself, when you remain with the silence rather than drowning it. When you finally allow the questions you have been avoiding your entire adult life to surface and be asked. Who am I when I am not performing for anyone? What do I actually hold to be true, separate from what I was conditioned to believe? What have I been carrying that was never mine to carry? What did I sacrifice to remain acceptable? And was the exchange worth it? These questions terrify most people because answering them honestly demands confronting the gap between the version of yourself you have been presenting and the person you actually are underneath. It means looking at the life you assembled and conceding that significant portions of it were constructed by a version of you that didn't know any better. Or worse, a version that was performing for approval rather than building from authenticity. Jung found that individuals who resisted this inward turn became progressively more rigid, more anxious, more brittle as they aged. They doubled down on external pursuits, worked harder, stayed perpetually occupied, filled every available space with distraction. Some turned to substances, others turned to control, managing their families, their environments, their social circles with increasing compulsion, anything to avoid the terrifying stillness where genuine self-knowledge lives. But the people who accepted the inward turn, who permitted themselves to sit with the discomfort of honest self-examination, encountered something extraordinary. They discovered an entire interior world that had been operating beneath their awareness for decades. Emotions they had buried, longings they had abandoned, portions of themselves they had exiled in order to fit the shape of what was expected. And as they reconnected with this inner landscape, something fundamental shifted. The frantic compulsion to prove themselves in the external world began to quiet, not because they had surrendered, because they had located something more deeply satisfying than external validation. They had found themselves. If you feel that pull right now, that quiet sense that something inward is asking for your attention, type 11 in the comments. Right, 11, I am finally turning toward myself. Because that number carries the energy of new beginnings, of awakening, of the moment you stop looking outward and start listening within. And this community needs to witness the exact moment you chose to answer. The second pillar was what Jung considered the most demanding psychological work a human being could undertake, and the one most consistently avoided until crisis made avoidance impossible. He called it shadow integration, the act of facing everything you have spent your entire existence rejecting, suppressing, and concealing from the world and from yourself. Jung understood the shadow as the repository of everything you determined was unacceptable about your nature, your rage, your selfishness, your jealousy, your capacity for cruelty, your secret appetites, your shameful impulses, all of it compressed downward, sealed away, denied, because the first half of life demanded the presentation of an acceptable self. You absorbed the early lesson, what was rewarded and what was punished, and you shaped yourself accordingly. The traits that secured love and approval, you cultivated. The traits that provoked rejection or shame, you buried. Over decades, the distance between who you presented and who you actually were grew into a chasm.